Is Donald Trump a far right-wing Nazi? This is the thing that the left has been saying for a while now. Far right wing. But what does this mean? What does it mean to be far right? What is the history of this term far right? What about far left? Where does the whole left-right spectrum even come from? Today on the Justin Haskins Show, we're going to do a little history lesson about the far right and the far left and just the whole idea of a left-right spectrum. We're going to talk about where this came from and why the average person really doesn't understand what far right or far left means, or why conservatives in the United States of America shouldn't be labeled far right Nazis. That's actually an oxymoron. You can't be, in the American context, a far right Nazi. Nazis were actually on, from an American perspective, the political and ideological left. And so really, Nazis should be far left-wing. But the left doesn't want to do that. Why? Because it doesn't serve their purposes. So we're going to talk about that today. A little bit of a history lesson today on the Justin Haskins Show. Thank you for joining me. My name is Justin Haskins, in case you didn't guess. Quick call to action before we get into the details of the history, a really fascinating history of the left-right spectrum and where it comes from. Please like this video, leave a comment, let me know what you think about it, and of course, subscribe to the channel. It's still a fairly new channel. My name is Justin Haskins. I'm a New York Times best-selling author, a widely published writer, researcher, but I've never had my own YouTube channel until recently. This is the first time I've had my own show, and I need your support. So the more you like these videos, leave comments, subscribe, all of that stuff's going to help break through big tech algorithms that hold content like this back. So it is much appreciated. It doesn't cost anything but just a little bit of your time. And it goes a long way to helping more people see this content. Okay, so first of all, let's just bring up this article that I stumbled across. This is not the only article that's like this, obviously, but there are a lot of articles like it. If you're watching the YouTube version of the show, the video version of the show, you can see the headline says, Trump and GOP repeatedly echo Nazi and far-right ideology as they aim to retake White House. This is something that you see all the time. I found this after just 2 seconds of doing a Google search. It's from the Los Angeles Times. But there's all sorts of other mainstream outlets that talk in this way. They refer to Trump and Republicans as being somehow tied to the far right or Nazism. And they've been able to get away with this because I think for a lot of people, they understand that Republicans, and especially conservative Republicans, are on the right, because even conservatives will refer to themselves as being on the right. And of course, if you're really far on the right, you're the far right, and we all know that the far right is related to the Nazis. Why? Because we hear about this all the time in our history books, that this was a far right-wing fringe group. But what people don't understand is that the terms left and right in the European context are completely different than the left and right in the American context. And that the terms left and right, left wing and right wing, come from a really contentious, radical time in Europe where things were not at all like the ideological battles that we have here in the United States. And so the terms, which only got exported into the United States much later, really don't translate very well. But the media and liberals and Democrats, they like to pretend that they do because it benefits their side to label people who are really conservative far right, just like the Nazis. Now, I could give you the short history of this, but rather than give it to you myself, my own version of it, I'm going to read to you an unbiased source so that you can see for yourself what I'm talking about. This comes from history.com. Okay? This is hardly a bastion of republicanism or something like that. Where did the terms left wing and right wing come from? It has to do with seating arrangements. This is really interesting stuff. Today, the terms left-wing and right-wing are used as symbolic labels for liberals and conservatives. This is some reading from the article. But they were originally coined in reference to the physical seating arrangements of politicians during the French Revolution. The split dates to the summer of 1789, when members of the French National Assembly met to begin drafting a constitution. I'll give you a little bit more information about that in a second. The delegates were deeply divided over the issue of how much authority King Louis XVI, he's the guy who ended up getting, his head cut off, Marie Antoinette, that whole thing, of how much authority King Louis XVI should have. And as the debate raged, the two main factions each staked out territory in the assembly hall. So we're talking about the National Assembly. The anti-royalist revolutionaries seated themselves to the presiding officer's left, while the more conservative aristocratic supporters of the monarchy gathered to the right. Okay. So these divisions, we're going to skip ahead a little bit. These divisions only continued during the 1790s, when newspapers began making reference to the progressive left and traditionalist right of the French Assembly, based on where they sat in the assembly hall. The distinctions later vanished for several years during the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte, the dictator. But with the Bourbon Restoration and the beginning of a constitutional monarchy in 1814, liberal and conservative representatives once again took up their respective posts on the left and right of the legislative chamber, again echoing a more radical, progressive left wing and a more royalist supporting groups that supported traditional monarchy and that sort of thing on the right. Okay. By the mid-19th century, the terms left and right had entered the French vernacular as shorthand for opposing political ideologies. Political parties even began self-identifying as center-left, center-right, extreme left, and extreme right. So this left and right label ended up going out to the rest of the world throughout the 1800s. But the writer says, and by the way, the writer of this article, who did a really great job, is Evan Andrews at history.com. Okay. But he says, but they weren't common in English-speaking countries until the early 20th century, meaning the 1900s. The terms are now used to describe the opposing ends of the political spectrum, but their origins are still evident in the seating arrangements of many legislative bodies, because still the left-wing and right-wing factions tend to sit apart from each other on opposite sides of the chambers. So the whole context of this arose in the French Revolution. Specifically, in 1789, they were debating about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And this came into existence, this is from the French government, under the history of the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This came into existence in the summer of 1789, born of an idea of the Constituent Assembly. The idea here was to draft a new constitution and precede it with a declaration of principles. So this is all taking place in the context of the world being rocked by the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution of the United States, which is all being developed around within this exact same time period. And some of the leaders of the American Revolution were influential in the creation of some of these documents in France, specifically Thomas Paine, the person, the English writer most famous for writing Common Sense in the United States. There were many proposals. The Constituent Assembly tasked 5 deputies, and then it goes on to talk about the French Declaration and how it was written in 1789. Ratified on the 5th of October by Louis XVI under pressure from the Assembly and the people who had rushed to Versailles, it served as a preamble of the first constitution of the French Revolution, which happened later in 1791. So all of this is happening within the chaos of the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille, which happened at another point in time in 1789. And so this is all, this sort of left-right distinction is all happening within that context of the French Revolution. So the terms left-right, as this writer for history.com, Evan Andrews, pointed out, emerged within the context of the French Revolution and then was exported to the rest of the world, and eventually in the 19th century, in the 20th century, ends up being used in English-speaking countries like America, where they start using this term left and right. Now, later on in European history, you get the so-called traditionalist Nazis who start, they brand themselves as traditionalists. They're the Third Reich. They're sort of reestablishing the dominance of the Aryan race and the Germanic peoples of the world and all this stuff. And it's like the new Roman Empire, and all of this is the language. And so they're acting strong, nationalistic, centralized government, and they're presenting themselves as a right-wing group. And so in Europe, they think of the extreme far right as being aligned with Nazism, because Nazism was sort of the modern, really dangerous far right ideology in Europe. And obviously Nazism is really terrible. Other kinds of far right ideologies that exist in the European context aren't necessarily related to Nazis, but maybe extreme versions of nationalism mixed with some sort of support for a monarchy or some sort of support for a dictatorship or something along those lines. But the point is this: within the context of the European Union, within the context of Europe, not just the European Union, but Europe, and really a lot of the world, right wing means traditionalist, but traditionalist in that context means powerful central government, monarchy or empire or dictator or something of that nature, because that's what traditionalism meant throughout much of Europe. Now, not all of Europe would understand the far right in that way. It's not fair to slap that label on every far right-wing group in Europe, but that's generally speaking why we refer to the Nazis as far right. Because within the European context, especially in Germany, that would have been a more traditionalist understanding as opposed to a more progressive understanding in Germany, which would have been more international communism. Think Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and people like that. They all lived in that same part of the world. And for them, left wing meant communism. All right. And its furthest form, you sort of like a utopian communism. And internationalism was often common. So they didn't they weren't a fan of nationalistic ideas, and they weren't a fan of traditional ideas, culturally or in religion and things like that. That's why you have Karl Marx saying things like religion is the opiate of the masses and that kind of thing. Right. So this is the context of left and right. So when it gets translated to the English-speaking world, but especially America in the 20th century, then what ends up happening is you have a translation problem. Because although, yes, you have right-wing meaning traditionalism in the United States doesn't mean traditionalism in Europe. It doesn't mean monarchy and powerful central government and empire like Roman Empire and Third Reich and all of that. It means what? Going to George Washington and limited central government and a constitutional republic and the Declaration of Independence. Whereas in revolutionary France, they liked the idea of Declaration of Independence on the far left in opposition to the monarchy. So left-right in Europe means something very different than it does in the United States. So properly speaking, under the United States left-right spectrum, with right-wing meaning limited government, limited constitutional republic, supporter of individual liberties, deconstructing powerful centralized government, overthrowing monarchies, that's what it means to be far right in the United States. In Europe, far right meant powerful government and actually supporting monarchies. So think about how absurd it is to refer to far right-wing Americans as being far right in sort of the Nazi far right European way of thinking about it. At the time that the American Revolution occurred, to be far right meant to support the king. Right? So think about that. Like, those terms weren't being used at that time, but that's what it would have meant. To be a traditionalist, to be a Tory, to support the king, that would have been far right in the American revolutionary context under the European model. But obviously, to be left wing, to be liberal, meant to be supporting of individual liberty and deconstructing the monarchy, getting rid of the monarchy, and replacing it with a constitutional republic. So left-right spectrum didn't mean the same thing at all. So when the left refers to Donald Trump as being, or Republicans, as they did in that LA Times article that I cited before, as being right-wing or far right-wing in line with Nazis, it doesn't actually make any sense. The Nazis were not a limited government group, and Donald Trump and Republicans support fewer regulations. It supports a smaller central government. They're supposed to be advocating for limited spending, government spending. They don't always do that. Lower taxes, less government involvement in your personal life. That's what it means to be a far right-wing Republican or a far right-wing American. The furthest, most extreme form of right-wing ideology in the American context is not supporting a king or empire or emperor. It would be, or dictator or Third Reich or something like that. It's not Nazism, which supported a powerful centralized government. That's what Nazi is. The Nazi ideology was. What it means is, like, the furthest right you could go on the American spectrum would be like basically a really extreme libertarian, or like an anarcho-capitalist or something, where you have free markets with almost no government or no government. That would be the furthest right you could go in the American context, deconstructing a federal government. So far right-wing and far left-wing in the United States doesn't mean the same thing as it does in Europe. So when the left takes that term, far right Nazi, and tries to impose it on Republicans, they are being incredibly dishonest. At best, wildly ignorant. But I think in a lot of cases, incredibly dishonest. And to really hammer home this point, the Nazis were the National Socialist Party of Germany. That's what Nazis were. That's what it meant to be a Nazi. National Socialist Party of Germany. So obviously, we're talking about left-wing people. And this is why, when you look at the history of what the Nazis did, they weren't limited government libertarian types. They supported eliminating gun rights. They supported massive government programs. They supported fascism, which involved combining the power of a centralized government with private corporations, but with being controlled by the central powers. Right? So they didn't support free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. They didn't support any of that. They weren't Bible-thumping Christians. They didn't like Christianity. They didn't like traditional values. So none of this works. No matter what the left tells you, none of it works. None of it makes any sense. The fact of the matter is this. The Nazis were a far left-wing group on the American spectrum. They weren't the same as the socialist, international socialist, communist types that you had in some parts of the Soviet Union and things like that. They weren't like that. Okay, they weren't communists. But in the American context, the communists, who would be considered the far left in Europe, are on the left in the United States, and the fascist Nazis would also be on the left in the United States, because both of them are on the progressive, powerful government, limiting traditional, constitutional Jeffersonian values. They don't want that. And so it's just apples and oranges, the comparison. So the next time somebody tells you that Donald Trump is on the far right, he's a Nazi, or that Republicans are Nazis, or anything like that, immediately dismiss it and say, actually, the Nazis were on the left. They were on the far left. But we just have a different understanding in America of left and right as they do in Europe. But if the Nazis of Germany existed in the United States, everyone would have considered them to be on the left wing of the spectrum. And in fact, there were Nazi sympathizers in the United States. There were people who liked what Hitler was doing early on, and they were all progressives. They were all on the left. None of them were limited government, Republican, conservative types. They were considered progressive elites. They were on the left, and if they were alive today, they would still be voting for Democrats. I'm not trying to say that Democrats today are Nazis. I'm not trying to say that at all. I'm just saying that on the left-right spectrum, that's how things would play out in America. So don't let the left lie to you about this. It just isn't true. It's completely false. It isn't in line with history. It shows that a lot of people on the left are completely ignorant of history, or in some cases, incredibly dishonest. Okay, enough of the history lessons for today. That's the left-right wing spectrum. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes for you to read more about it. Until next time, my name is Justin Haskins. Thank you for watching. Please leave a comment. Let me know what you think of the video. Let me know about the left-right wing spectrum, and, express some frustration if you feel it, because this just drives me absolutely crazy every time I see that. I always read the comments. I don't typically respond. Sometimes I do, but I don't typically respond, but I always read the comments. So please leave a comment, like the video, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff's going to help me out. Until next time, my name is Justin Haskins. Please stay free.